Hello, BookTube. I have another starter kit for you today. A starter kit for historical fiction. As far as I can recall, I have somehow never done this, but even if I have, this can still act as just a concerted blast of recommendations for you. Strong recommendations for historical fiction of all kinds. But before we start, we should clarify our terms. Of course, what is historical fiction? It's not enough to say that it's fiction set in the past, because that isn't necessarily historical fiction. When I was the editor for the online version of a historical novel review, I went by their guidelines, which was the main body of the story. In other words, more than half of the story has to take place more than 50 years prior to the date of the book's publication. And I was willing to live with that, and that seemed pretty okay to me. But I think I want to go even further than that. I think that in order for it to qualify as historical fiction, the events in the novel should not only be 100% historical. There shouldn't be any of this time jumping, or not much of it, barely any of it. It shouldn't be the whole setup of the book. But also, the events in the book should not overlap with the author's lifetime at all. So if we use that as a guideline, that rules out a lot of books that I would otherwise have on this list. Great works of now we would certainly consider them historical fiction, which were contemporary at the time of the author, or relatively so. Just the amount of time necessary for the author to cool their jets and write a manuscript. Instead, we're going to do, for this list, we're going to do books where the events do not overlap with the author's timeline at all, where they are history to the author. And that leaves us only with a question of execution. Because there are two ways to do historical fiction. There are two poles and a spectrum of gradient between them for how to do historical fiction. And we've talked about this many times before when we talk about the genre. One of those ways is to be historically accurate as much as possible, including not only the way the characters talk, but the things they care about, where you are immersing your reader in the extremely well-researched, usually the extremely well-researched time period where you've set your book. That is one way to do historical fiction. And the other way is to map your present onto some aspect of the past, so the characters don't talk the way they did in their own time. Instead, they talk the way you do in your time. They don't think the way people did in those old days. They think and talk and believe the things they care about and prioritize are all immediately recognizable to a contemporary audience. And either one of those is okay. There's not like one is legitimate and one's not. It's just that you are going to develop preferences, almost certainly, for which kind you prefer. So it's worthwhile to keep it in mind. Although I would think that if you really love historical fiction, I absolutely love historical fiction, you would be willing to take anything that was well done, even if it was the kind of historical fiction you don't typically like. Lord knows I have. This list is going to show. I've loved examples from both. So the first one we're going to do is a big, early, major piece of historical fiction that I'm going to call historical fiction because the raw nub of the events in the book did actually happen, probably many times. The event itself didn't. The event itself is an object of mythology, and ordinarily I would like to rule that out, just like I don't want any historical fiction set in the Garden of Eden or on the Ark of Noah. I want it to be actual history, not something out of mythology, but I'm allowing this on a technicality, not only because I love it and just recently mentioned it, but also because there is historical nub of truth to the event, which is the Trojan War. The Trojan War, in its raw essence, probably does commemorate a series of trade wars between major powers in the area, with mythology accruing to it over the centuries. And one of the earliest people to do a full-length, full-dress piece of Trojan War fiction was Chaucer in his book Troilus and Cressida. And that's what this is. This is the story of a romance between two young people set against the backdrop of the siege of Troy that is immortalized in Homer's Iliad. Only this is really good. This is really, really good. You get all sorts of familiar named characters, but also a classic trio of characters that aren't familiar. Troilus and Cressida, and also Pandarus. So this is terrific to read in a modernized version, an illustrated version, or in Chaucer's original if you want to give it a little extra effort. Naturally, this has a warm place in my heart because I also write historical fiction. Not for publication. That seems to throw people off. I just write for the enjoyment of it. Right, those of you who write fiction will know how enjoyable it is. It's incredible. It's an incredible feeling. And I don't have any problem with self-motivation. So I write his fiction for my own personal sake. I haven't done it in the last few months, and that's bad. And I feel the lack of it. So I need to work more in next year. But I have written, roughly speaking, you could say a trilogy of books about the Trojan War, starting with Troy War and then moving on to Steve Donahue's Ulysses, not James Joyce's Ulysses. The title of the book is Steve Donahue's Ulysses. And finishing up with the Telemachiad about Ulysses' teen dream teenage son. So I, on one level, I understand directly why Chaucer would be pulled to this story and want to use it as a backdrop. He does a great job. Then we can move on to the second kind of historical fiction I was talking about, where you pick a historical time period, but you infuse it with modern sensibilities, your sensibilities. And this is, most of these things on this list I have recommended many, many times before. Just take this. You don't have to take it as a starter kit. If I've done this before, you can just take it as a list of recommendations. And this is God Knows by Joseph Heller, most famous for Catch-22, but this is a much stronger book. Almost everything that he wrote is a much stronger book than Catch-22. And this is the story of King David from the Bible. Only it's a King David who is completely contemporary. I mean, he is set in the time of warfare in Judea and the time of Saul and the time of his commanders and Goliath and what is set in the mythos of the Old Testament. But this David knows all sorts of things about the contemporary world and talks about them that way. The humor, there's dark humor that runs throughout this book. It's all very contemporary and wonderful. Wonderfully heartfelt. We don't have to get into the reasons why. I think some of the reasons why are not all that attractive. There are aspects of Joseph Heller that are not all that attractive the more you know them, but the novel is terrific. Then we can move to ancient Egypt, which has been the source of innumerable historical fiction. And I want to pick one that I really enjoy it. It was the product of a modicum of research, so it is mostly modern sensibilities mapped onto ancient Egypt. Of course, ancient Egypt gives you a vast canvas to map your fiction onto. But I want to choose Agatha Christie. Death Comes as the End. Which is, I don't think this is one of her most known, most read books. It's one, I think it's her only foray into historical fiction. I think it's terrific. I just love it. I wish that I had a paperback copy of this thing. Actually, I wish that I had this paperback copy, because those old pocketbook paperbacks are really well made. They do not fall apart. I'm always complaining about how mass markets fall apart, but these don't. So I wouldn't mind having this at all if I could find it. But this is just a terrific story. It'll teach you as much as Agatha Christie taught herself about ancient Egypt. Then, of course, another setting for historical fiction is ancient Rome. And there are lots of candidates here that are very didactic and some very long. But sometimes the most satisfying historical fiction is murder mysteries. Because the author knows that they have to fill in the historical period convincingly, but they've got other business at hand. They've got a murder or two to tantalize you with. So they know that they can't overdo the info dumping. Usually you are spared the over-exposition of historical fiction, the bane of historical fiction, if you read a murder mystery set in historical times, because the author has other stuff. They can't dump all their information on you. Some of them do, but most of them don't want to. And I want to recommend John Maddox Roberts. This is his book, SPQR. I believe this has an actual title now, but this is the mass market paperback that first appeared in the United States in like 1990, something like that. And then went on to be SPQR, SPQR2, SPQR3. And the series went on for a long time. For all I know, it's still going on. And so all the books have titles. They don't just have that as a title. I forget, this might be called The King's Ransom or something like that. But it's terrific. It stars a young man on the lowest rungs of the social climbing political ladder in the Rome immediately preceding the rampaging changes of Julius Caesar and then Augustus Caesar. So this person, Decius Metellus, he lives through it all. But here he is narrating an adventure that he has early in his life, when he is a very, very low-ranking official in Rome, but a high enough ranking official so that he has access to all the machinery that he needs in order to solve a crime, a murder, and then another murder. And it's wonderful. Roberts is so good at working in the information, the realities of first century Rome, that you won't feel like you're reading info dumps at all. It's just, the whole series is wonderful, but you definitely want to start as early as possible in it. And when it comes to Roman historical fiction, we will deal with a biggie, but it's really good. It's well worth your time. This is Howard Fast. And again, we don't have to talk about personal qualities of the author. And this is his book, Spartacus, which is extremely well known. This is the story of a slave rebellion against Rome at right around the same time as the SPQR books are set. A slave rebellion that grew and grew, I would argue largely through the incompetence of the commanders that were sent to quell it, but it became a famous movie, so that's all you need. But the thing is, the book is really good too. It's not as good as the movie. Very few books are, but it is really, really good. It's well worth your time, especially if you're just starting out on Roman historical fiction. Then we can move on to Victorian historical fiction, which it gained, I would argue, was created again. Chaucer had been dead for a long time, but I would argue that it was created again as a viable commercial genre in the Victorian era by this guy, by Sir Walter Scott. And I'm going to recommend here his book Ivanhoe, set in ye old Middle Ages, well before Scott was born, a time that he was comfortable not only researching to a fare thee well, but also slightly mythologizing. So you've got everything in here, damsels in distress and knights and an exiled king. It's wonderful. Of course, it's a whole diction. It's a whole way of writing that you have to get used to. But once you do, it really grips. Then we can move on to, for our subject matter, to Marco Polo. We can move on to Gary Jennings' novel, The Journeyer. This is the old mass-market paperback cover, but I don't know how many. I'm pretty sure this thing is not in print. This is a gigantic, lavish novel. This is an example of a trend that took hold in historical fiction and has largely become synonymous with it, that historical fiction novels tend to be huge. It wasn't always the case, but this is big, but you will want it to be longer. You will want it to be longer. This is a story of Marco Polo traveling with his uncles to the Far East, becoming attached eventually to the court of the great Khan, having adventures, military adventures, amorous adventures, and eventually, after all that time, making his way back home to Italy. And it's incredible. It's an amazingly good reading experience. If you ever are at a thrift shop and you see a battered mass market paperback of this thing, grab it. You're going to love it. You're absolutely going to love it. I think you're going to love everything on this list. Then we move to Shakespearean times. This is George Garrett. I've recommended this book many times before. This is his novel, Entered from the Sun, a novel about Christopher Marlowe. That is unlike, Marlowe has been the source of 80 million novels. This is unlike any of them. And this is, I believe, the quintessential distillation of this author's narrative genius. He would have disagreed with that. He would have said it was The Succession. He wrote a long novel called The Succession. He would have said that was his masterpiece. But in terms of his rhetorical abilities being sharpened mercilessly to an incredibly fine point, that's this book. Which you should go in prepared that Marlowe is not all that much of a character in the book. Then we can move on to a historical novel that in modern times needs no introduction at all. This is Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel. This is the story of Thomas Cromwell, he of the famous portrait. There's a famous portrait of Thomas Cromwell where he looks like he's about to explode. Where is that portrait in America? Is it in the Museum of Fine Arts in New York, or is it in the Frick? I think it might be in the Frick. Well, anyway, it's a famous portrait. It's not on the cover of this for some unknown reason. It's not on the cover of any of these. This was the first of 3 books about Thomas Cromwell by Hilary Mantel. That portrait is nowhere to be seen, even though it's described in the book. where Cromwell steps away from the portrait and is horrified by what it looks like. He says, "I look like a murderer," and his own son says, "What, you didn't know?" It's a terrific moment. You'd think it would be on the cover of one of these things, but no. But in this novel, Hilary Mantel takes Thomas Cromwell from flashbacks to his earliest youth, to his mysterious past in Italy, and all the way to being a member of Parliament and then finally a lawyer for King Henry VIII. And it's great. Absolutely great. It has been universally praised by critics, which doesn't always happen, especially since there are a couple of critics you can always rely on out there to resist jumping on any bandwagon, so that even if most critics are praising something, there'll always be a couple of holdouts. And if they aren't holdouts, then you know you're dealing with the real thing. And you should not delay any longer in reading that thing. And for a long, long time, two of the most regular of those critical holdouts, the ones who resisted jumping on any kind of bandwagon, were me and Christopher Hitchens. And we both agreed about this book. This is fantastic. So you should read it, whether you've read Tudor fiction or not. Then we move to Stephen O'Connor's debut. This is another thing that pushes the envelope in the second kind of historical fiction that seems a little strange, imports a lot of dreamlike elements of the modern era into the past. This is Thomas Jefferson Dreams of Sally Hemings. I had my doubts going into this book because a lot of flapdoodle has been written about Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. A lot of nonsense has been written about how he loved her, about Sheila, how she loved him, about how they had a forbidden romance, something like that. There's nothing of the kind. None of that is true. He didn't love her because she wasn't human. She was property. And she didn't love him because she wasn't human. She was property. And they didn't have a love affair because she wasn't human. She was property. They never made love. He raped her. I don't care what she said. I don't care what she wrote. I don't care what she thought. She was property. So she wasn't able, it was basically a chair. And if you lose sight of that, you lose sight of the evil of this relationship. You lose sight of the essential evil of slavery. The first thing you do to humanize the slave in a situation like this is free them. Once you've done that, that's number one. That's the first thing you do. Once you've done that, then we can talk about I love her and she loves me and we're devoted to each other and we make love and whatnot. Then you can talk about all of that. You can't talk about any of that if the person is your property. And so I worried about this book, but it manages to skirt that line fairly well. There were parts of this book that deeply moved me, but never in anger. It really is quite extraordinary. Then we can move to another book that I've recommended a million times before. I'll recommend it again gladly for historical fiction. This is The Killer Angels by Michael Shara. This is a novel about the Battle of Gettysburg, where Lee and his army marched north to invade the Union. And the two armies, his and General Meade's, met at a town called Gettysburg and slugged it out for a few days. And whether or not you think you're a Civil War guy, whether or not you think that you like military fiction, whether or not you think you like the Battle of Gettysburg, no matter what, this is going to win you over. Far more readily than, for instance, Wolf Hall, which will win you over. But this will do it far more readily. This is the Civil War in the United States has never effectively ended. So if you're an American reader, this will win you over immediately. It's a fantastic historical novel, just fantastic. Not least of which because the author is steeped in the knowledge of the period and all of his characters, including the secondary and tertiary characters. You can tell, if you know those characters, you can tell that Shara knows everything about them, that he's researched them for endless days and kept almost all of it out of the narrative. It's the opposite of info dumping. It's incredible how it works. And then we can finish up with another book that is, it's unusual, like Wolf Hall, because its main character is a bad guy, and also, like Wolf Hall, although much more so, it's not trying to whitewash the bad guy. It's not trying to say that he wasn't bad. Hilary Mantel falls in love with Thomas Cromwell, or was in love with him before she wrote her book. So there's a lot of that in there. Thomas Cromwell was a bad guy, but so is Mussolini. that's this book. This is M, Son of the Century, by Antonio Scarlatti. This is translated by Anne Milano Appel into English, and it's terrific. Now, it's about a young Mussolini when he had movie star good looks, a jaw to die for, was a writer, a pamphleteer, a journalist, didn't know what he wanted to do with his life, didn't know what position it was, what shape it was going to take. And that's it. That's mostly all that this is about. The insurgent political movements of 1930s Italy, with Mussolini in the center. And you would think when you heard that, well, okay, I'm not a World War II guy. I'm not interested in Mussolini at all. But if I were going to read a novel about him, surely I would read a novel about him as dictator of Italy. I wouldn't read anything about a young Mussolini. And I'm telling you, much like with Wolf Hall, I am telling you, it doesn't matter whether or not you're interested in the subject. You are still going to be swept away by this book. So I urge you to give it and everything else on this list a try. So there you go. That is a historical fiction starter kit for you. I don't think I've ever done one that was just that. But if I have, probably there'll be overlap with this one. Just consider it. If I have, and I just didn't find it, just consider these recommendations, random historical fiction recommendations, to get you through the end of the week. And I'll wrap this up for now, and I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.